Well, hey there, folks. How you doing? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Simeon here with you today. So I've been wanting to talk to you about the very exciting subject of permittivity and permeability, some of the fundamental constants of physics that make up our universe, and how if we do a kind of more in-depth examination of these ideas and mathematical concepts, it actually leads us to a deeper understanding of what we call supernatural and paranormal. And yes, I am talking about the work of Ken Radford Shoulders, this very incredibly intelligent and creative physicist who is credited with developing some of the fundamental masking techniques in electronics, in microelectronics, for developing circuit boards, electron beam lithography, and also credited with the development of the quadrupole mass spectrometer, something that was initially conceived of by the German physicist Wolfgang Pauli decades and decades before, but Shoulders was the first one to create one of these spectrometers, which has to do with detecting ions with these four columns of beams of metal. So what I want to talk about to you about Shoulders is his paper called Permittivity Transitions. I have been reading this over and over again for several years, ever since I included portions of it in my book, Dark Matter Monsters, because the implications of this paper, which he wrote, I believe, in September 2000, Shoulders passed on, I believe it was in 2013. So he's no longer with us in person, just in spirit. But this was done in 2000, and it was a follow-up to his work, EV, A Tale of Discovery, where he talks about what he initially called electron vortices, later electron validium charge clusters, electronic charge clusters. Maybe you've experienced this in terms of static electricity. That's my view of it. And also Bob Greenyer of the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, that we're all talking about the same thing here: static electricity, charge clusters. And what Shoulders wrote about specifically, exotic vacuum objects, what he called EVOs. These are charge clusters that exist in very low density gases or vacuum states. And Shoulders argued that these were a form of micro ball lightning. What we call ball lightning is just a bigger version of these charge clusters, which are an example of coherent matter, where all the particles are at the same frequency and temperature, and they have this kind of coherency as a structure. And the significance of this is it creates another state of matter. You and I are used to this idea that charges that are similar, like charges, right, two negative charges, repel each other. And that's what we've been taught. That's the dogma. And that has led us to kind of perceive this sort of wall of lack of information about what's going on at a subatomic or subelectronic level, microscopic electronic level. But what Shoulders and others like Kouropoulos have argued is that that repulsion between like charges, whether it's positive charges or negative charges, only applies at relatively long ranges. But at shorter distances, you will find that like charges attract each other, and they keep attracting and attracting until they create another state of matter, what some people have called negative inertial mass. It's a type of matter with exotic physical properties. And interestingly enough, this is not a completely new idea. If you look at the work of Wilhelm Weber, the very amazing physicist who did work in the early 1800s all the way to the mid-century, who preceded Maxwell by several decades. And you can read about Weber in the work of André Koch-Torres Assis, who I first learned about on Alexander Unziger's YouTube channel, where he interviewed Assis. He also appears as a special guest from time to time on the Demystify Psi podcast, which I can also recommend. It's a very fascinating podcast that talks about topics like this. What Weber found is that just using Newtonian laws, because of Newton's equations, Newton's third law, you will get highly attractive forces at very close distances, the R function in Newton's equations. And when the distances get very close together, Weber predicted negative inertial mass, which is a type of mass where things attract each other and the typical laws of motion are reversed. The long and the short of it is that negative inertial mass predicts a lot of cool exotic physics properties like Alcubierre warp drives and superconductivity. How cool is that? Derived all from Newtonian equations. Well, here's the thing about shoulders. He made the same argument with these EVOs, these electronic charge clusters, just like very similar to some of the arguments of Ed Lewis, cold fusion Leonard, researcher Takeaki Matsumoto, the Japanese researcher who talked about microball lightning. And here's what I want to talk to you about today, which makes this so interesting. Shoulders argued that these charge clusters literally change the structure of space-time. They lower what we call the permittivity, the dielectric constant of space. And just for a quick review, why this matters so much, here's something that I always keep in my office. I never have it too far away. Just to remind myself, guys, the speed of light, which we are told is a constant, it's been drilled into our head ever since we were little kids. Speed of light is a constant, right? Roughly 300,000 kilometers a second. It's actually based on permittivity times permeability square root divided into 1 equals the speed of light. So if you have substances that are oscillating or changing their permittivity, like Shoulders argues with microball lightning, you will have changes in the speed of light. Okay? It's just based on this equation, which has been known about again since the 1800s. The speed of light, something that, researchers back then, they were called natural philosophers. I believe it was Ulmer, the scientist Ulmer, who started getting an estimate of the speed of light. It was Weber and Kohlrausch, who I believe 1847, again, decades before James Clerk Maxwell comes onto the stage, got very close to estimating the speed of light because it's an electromagnetic wave, and they did this from laboratory experiments on static and magnetic charges. We're able to get very close to what we now know is the speed of light. So what Shoulders argues, which is really fascinating, is it's as you have these charge clusters around, and folks, these are around you all the time. You see them at night on the sheets in your bed when you ruffle the sheets and you see those static charges. When you touch your dog, he's here somewhere, and you get a shock or a light switch. Those are mini charge clusters. They're transient. They don't last very long, but those are an example, very close in the same family as EVOs that Shoulders is talking about. What Shoulders argues, and the reason I want to make this video, because it's something I've been really considering for a couple of years now. He argued that these create another state of matter with another speed of light, and that they create properties which you and I consider to be, and he doesn't say this directly, but he gets very close to it, paranormal supernatural. So let's just look at Ken Shoulders' paper for a second. I think you're going to see how cool this is. First of all, he argues that these micron-sized clusters of electrons have a couple different states, and depending on the different types of charge masking that they possess, they can form a black EV state. Okay, so you and I normally, when you see little sparks, they're bright, they're white, something like that. There's also the dark EV, which you won't see, but I can show you this picture here of Russian researcher Shapeshifters, who was able to photograph what appears to be a black EV right in the lab. Okay, this famous picture from the Shapeshifters generator in the experiments generated black EVs. And he goes on to say they have a unidirectional current flow, which we'll see why this matters in a second. But they create a type of pseudo particle entanglement. Now, we've heard a lot about this idea of quantum entanglement and quantum computers, the idea that particles that are entangled can share information or at least be correlated across huge distances. The distance doesn't matter anymore. He's saying you sort of get the same sort of thing, the same sort of entanglement feature with charge clusters. And then here's the kicker. Here is the kicker. Here it comes. Complex organisms are discussed composed entirely of electron vortex structures that are self-formed at electronic rates without using mechanical or chemical methods. We're talking about completely electronic type of life forms in the same space that you and I are in right now. And they're decoupled from us because they have a different permittivity, hence their frame of reference is a little different than ours. The speed of light is faster, the permittivity is lower, and this creates a type of bubble within our own reality for structures to exist and life forms right around us. And that's really the point of this. These are not parallel realities in the way we usually think about it. Parallel realities, as you're aware if you've been watching my channel for a while or seen my lectures, parallel realities are something I've studied a lot. It goes back to Hugh Everett III at Princeton as a grad student, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, the idea of branching realities, and other people had speculated about it before Hugh Everett. He just was very good at math. And he created the equations to show why he thought this was the only interpretation of quantum mechanics that made sense. And people like David Deutsch and other researchers, Max Tegmark and others, believe that makes sense. You can have other ways of looking at it, but Everett argued that's the simplest way to interpret quantum mechanics is branching realities, that all of them are real, but the observer is only seeing one of them at a time. There's also the many interacting worlds model that says all these different realities pre-exist and they sort of create a type of pressure and influence each other very subtly, but they're all real. And that's the idea of other realities having some sort of influence on our reality, but you don't necessarily interact with them directly. In Hugh Everett's model, they never interact again. But this is a little different. What Shoulders is telling us here is that within our own reality, there are decoupled structures and life forms based on dark, exotic vacuum objects and charge clusters and groups of charge clusters at greatly reduced levels of permittivity with a faster speed of light than we are used to, and they're going to look very strange to us. They're going to look kind of weird. And he's giving us the scientific basis. You can find the link for this paper below. We're really lucky to have had Shoulders write about this. So let's just take a look at some of the passages here. I don't want to bore you with it, just reading the whole article. The writing, but it is so profound what he's saying here. And I think it makes so much sense, and it satisfies so much of what we're looking for in science, which is some sort of consistency of the ideas. And I think it explains so much data of what we see with the paranormal and supernatural phenomena. At least that's what we call it. So he says here that why the EV is so common and easy to produce is still a mystery, but it seems to be related to uncompensated charge density, where you have lower energy states of the charge. Now, why would that matter, uncompensated charge density? Well, if you have an object that is charge neutral, it's going to have the ability to pass through other objects. Just like you see ball lightning going through glass and other solid objects. Of course, it's not just ball lightning, it's things like ghosts, different types of cryptids, creatures, and so forth that allegedly, and I know people who've seen this with their own eyes, literally pass through walls. That's what he's talking about here, just on a microscopic scale. And he has these pictures of these EVOs forming these bead structures and these fractal patterns that we've seen in other videos I've talked about. So here's where it gets really interesting. He says the black electron vortex or exotic vacuum object seems to lack states to couple into our region of normal permittivity. Ergo, a form of superconductivity exists here. Your devices going beep, beep, beep are not going to do too well around that, right? We've talked about this before. I've seen it myself around crop circles many times. The state of existence of a black EV is bounded by high permittivity, producing a shielding effect, which means they can affect you, but you can't affect them. Within this cocoon, the black EV slides around with ease. So these are like objects in our own reality, but they're not coupled into our reality because they have a different permittivity, much lower than ours. Permittivity being the ability of an object to resist electrical current, an external electric field. And the lower permittivity has less ability to resist that, so it's going to be more electrically interactive. So he goes on to say that this is very interesting. The charge in an EV doesn't go in a typical loop like we're used to. So it flows around without being registered on our devices, which means your electromagnetic ghost detector is not going to go beep, beep, beep. I know some of you, and you've seen these shows, where people walk around with magnetometers. We did this in the crop circles in the UK with electrostatic meters, magnetometers. Sometimes you got a result on the magnetometer like the circle at Milton Hill Farms in 2000, which I've talked about. Ron Russell and I went out there. And Colin Andrews and his research partner, his French research partner, had gone out there and detected huge magnetic changes. But you don't always get that in magnetometer. We did find a lot of static charges, though. And so Shoulders goes on to talk about the effect on vector potential. Now, guys, this is getting really heavy here. He says, under these conditions where you have the charge is not flowing in a loop and therefore not registering on our instruments, you're going to get the basis for magnetic monopoles, something that's seen in cold fusion, Lanner, coherent energy transformations, as it's now called. Something that was predicted by Paul Dirac, I believe, in the 1920s, just using the equations of quantum mechanics. Magnetic monopoles being objects that have magnetic charge without having a north or south, just pure magnetic charge like we have electric charge. And under these conditions, you can affect vector potential. Hello? What does that allow you to do? That allows you to have communication that's not shielded by normal conventional conductors and cannot be detected by normal electromagnetic means. So basically, we're talking about electrons that have entirely different properties than the types of electrons we're used to. And this might create the ability to have a communications method where you're not using vector kinetics, but potential energy. You're affecting the potential, vector potential energy, which means it's non-electromagnetic. It would allow you to have communication at a distance that would not be detectable by ordinary means. You could think how useful that might be. And some of us think this might be the basis for remote viewing, resonant viewing, as I like to call it, right? Where the signal travels from here to there without going through the intervening space in a way that an electromagnetic wave usually propagates. And by the way, Shoulders has an example here where he shows the white exotic vacuum object, then it goes dark, turns into the black state, then it goes white again into the visible state. So, I mean, I think you can kind of see where this is going. He's suggesting the idea of objects, processes, phenomena, and life forms that are in a different state of being than we are in, that exist in the space around us, but normally we can't see them. I'm not trying to scare you with this. I mean, I'm recording this right around Halloween in 2025. I'm not deliberately trying to scare you, but this is what this very well-accomplished physicist who invented some very important devices and is in your cell phone somewhere in the circuit board techniques for electronic masking for creating micro electronic circuits. Ken Shoulders is in your life. He's saying that you have this other type of reality around us, and that it creates these life forms. Now, he doesn't stop there. He says one of the things not mentioned is the likelihood of forming totally black organizations. Totally black organizations with ghostly properties. I'm not making this up. And being able to operate without our ability to see them in any presently available way. Black organizations with ghostly properties. What does that sound like to you? Because I know what that sounds like to me. It sounds like ghosts and men in black and shapeshifters and all that spooky wooky paranormal stuff that we're so fascinated by. Perhaps this is the scientific basis for ghosts, for shapeshifters, for cryptids, for men in black, for things that go boo in the night. The things that you and I know exist because you've either had the experience or, like me, you've spoken to people who've had these experiences and you know they experienced something and they're not likely to talk about it a lot of the time because they're afraid of the ridicule and the ostracism and accused of being pseudoscientists or believing in weird things. Well, here's a mainstream physicist who's saying it's real, and he's giving us the physics behind why it's real. It has to do with lower permittivity, so get over it. We've got the science, folks, to show why the paranormal exists. That's why I'm so excited about this article. I would encourage you to take a look at EVO, A Tale of Discovery. You can see how he kind of went in this direction. But I just think this stuff is fascinating. He links it up to the basis of how cold fusion works. At least it was called cold fusion. I mean, we don't think now that it's literally neutrons fusing at room temperature, but it's more a process of coherent energy and the effects of coherent energy on ordinary materials. This is why you get transmutation and other things that Bob Grenier and the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project have talked about so much, where I've learned about a lot of this. And so he says this is the basis of quote-unquote cold fusion, and it's the way that the electrons are emitted in these certain materials and the role of hydrogen with this micro ball lightning, which some of us think have to do with a positron, electron pairs or whatever. Well, this is what Takeaki Matsumoto, by the way, proposed all the way back in the 1990s or maybe even earlier than that. that what we call cold fusion is this micro ball lightning. What Shoulders is saying is this micro ball lightning has a lot of exotic properties to it, which may explain why when you have some of these reactors going, you get temperature changes in the room, like Jean-Paul Biberian. The French researcher has talked about the room getting colder. You get strange electromagnetic effects where people say their credit cards were wiped out by being around these devices, and other strange aspects of these types of reactors that, kind of lean in that direction. Shoulders goes also on to say here that this changes the velocity of light. It changes how time flows. And here's, one of the final statements he makes, which is just so fascinating. Operation of such systems would be as ghostly as it gets. Yes, as they should transition data to a normal permittivity level only at terminals intended for our use. It would not be smart to run such systems at high permittivity, as it would only degrade their performance. They should operate in their own natural realm and not ours, submerging only to communicate needed data to us. So what he's describing is another type of electronic process that operates at electronic speeds, that's created by the long-term sustenance of these charge clusters, not the little brief ones you see from a static electricity discharge from your finger or something like that, or when you're walking across a rug. But that just shows you how easy it is to create these types of charge clusters, as you and I can do it just walking around on a rug. You would imagine that a big hair-covered creature out in nature walking around could accumulate quite a bit of static charge too, which would lead to these charge clusters. And these charge clusters, even though I think you can see how they come about, the idea of this micro ball lightning structure and this kind of sustained cluster of electrons, should it exist for more than a few milliseconds, leads to very interesting effects, almost to the point where Shoulders here is describing another type of communication and another type of computation, right? Almost like another type of quantum computer, where these charge clusters almost are a life form, or if you take Shoulders literally here, he's saying they are life forms. And I would suggest that what we call paranormal phenomena, supernatural phenomena, even the capacities and the characteristics we see around Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the ability for them to be transparent, to disappear. I've spoken to witnesses who told me they've seen this with their eyes, even multiple people at the same time, where they just disappear into a tree or around a tree. Those sorts of effects where they seem to be able to go through solid structures at times, being able to transmute materials, generate things sometimes, seemingly just with their fingertips, and also the orbs that are seen around them, the anomalous light phenomena, the mind speak that people experience around Sasquatch, their sort of anti-gravity characteristics that seem to suggest that they're sliding and gliding over rough terrain and so forth. Plus all the sonic phenomena around Bigfoot, the sort of directed sound, the strange sounds that people hear, suggest to me this type of reality that Shoulders is talking about. In other words, if you can access these exotic vacuum objects in some sort of consistent and repeatable way, you can have access to different types of special powers, even what seemed to be like superpowers from our superheroes that we're used to seeing in Marvel movies and comics and things like this. Shoulders is saying this is real. Now, I queried ChatGPT about this article and what Shoulders had said and so forth. And it said, well, Shoulders was going, he's waxing philosophical here. It was sort of metaphysics, but that's not how I interpret it. When I read the Permittivity Transitions paper by Shoulders, he says his research into microelectronics, because of the special sort of inverse physics of microelectronics and highly attractive charge clusters, something again that Wilhelm Weber talked about in the 1840s, 150, almost 200 years ago now. It suggests other types of life forms in and around us. And I would suggest that these cryptids and Bigfoot are creatures that learned how to harness this power and this energy. And we're the ones who think we're so technologically advanced with all our gadgets and technology. But we're only dealing with half of the loop here. We're only dealing with the visible EVOs. That the other types of life forms have learned to tap into the darker side of these electronic vacuum objects. I'm not saying that they're negative in any sort of value judgment sort of way. We're just talking about a different type of energy, a different type of matter that is not so easily detectable or visible as ordinary matter. And I think when you look at something just like Taoism and the yin and the yang, that the light and the dark work together. And this is what my interpretation of Shoulders, and of course this is what led me to the idea of dark matter monsters and the connection to ball lightning and different types of secret life forms, right? Now, the final implication of this, again, and Shoulders doesn't quite mention it in this article, but he mentions it in some of his other writings, is that this may even be what has been referred to as dark matter. Dark meaning it's not necessarily physically black and dark, even though many of these Sasquatch sightings and other cryptids, people do say that the creatures seem darker than the background, which is something in and of itself is very interesting. What we're talking about, as Lisa Randall talks about in her very interesting and thought-provoking book, Dark Matter and the Dinosaurs, about her ideas about dark matter contributing to the meteor crash at Chicxulub in 65 million BC, leading to the destruction of the dinosaurs, that event. As she says, it's invisible matter. It's matter that it's transparent. Okay, that's what we're talking about. And so how many times have you heard of paranormal, supernatural phenomena, as we call it, being transparent, being invisible or semi-invisible, transparent? I mean, you read the Bigfoot literature and you see this over and over again. So in my view, in Simeon's view, this is all the same thing. Now, if you think it's something else, if you think there's another interpretation of this, I'm totally open to that. But that's how I see it. I think Shoulders is talking about what we're talking about here. He's talking about dark matter monsters. At least that's my view of it. And other types of creatures that we don't even have names for, because we're only used to half of the loop of the visible matter, and there's a whole different side to it. As he says, that is made up of black organizations with ghostly properties. I say take it literally, and that's exactly what we're talking about. No mincing words about it, no beating around the bush. Ken Shoulders is talking about what we call the paranormal, which, as you can see, is just another reality, para being next to our normal reality. It's another reality within our space that we normally don't see a lot. Now, why does it appear in certain areas, hotspots, vortex areas, and so forth? We can talk about that in another video, but that, to my mind, goes to the types of geology and cold fusion, linear, coherent energy reactions that go along with particular types of geology and how they generate their own types of static charges, which would lead to this type of phenomena and creating these organizations in different spaces, as many of you know, in places in the US and around the world. Now, one final comment. I have spoken to people who've actually seen living beings go right through walls. There was a fellow in our Bigfoot Zoom group, which we held continuously for over 2 years. We've taken a break at the moment, but we had a lot of different witnesses come into our Zoom group and tell us their stories. And one of these fellows told us how during, and he was from Arkansas, and how during dinner one night, everybody saw a black dog walk right through the wall. And his dad saw it too, and he was a state trooper who one time had worked on Bill Clinton's security detail when he was the governor in Little Rock, someplace I've actually been to teach RV at one point. And I got to meet one of Clinton's former press secretaries when he was the governor. So this whole family saw this black dog walk through the wall, and they actually got up and went around the house looking for the black dog. Now, they didn't find it. When he told one of his friends, according to this fellow, he said his friend, they had seen it too at one point in kind of a not too far away, same sort of neighborhood. So this is sort of what Shoulders is talking about, is when you have objects that are charge neutral, because charges are what keep matter, pushing against each other, negative and positive charges. If it's charge neutral, it can pass through other objects. And I believe what this fellow was talking about is actually that. Seeing a living object walk right through a wall. And I think Shoulders is telling us how it's done, okay? So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. Thanks for watching. As usual, please put your comments in the box below. Always happy to hear your point of view. Maybe there's another way to look at all this. Of course, I'm interested. So thanks for watching. Take care. We'll see you in the next video. Take care for now, and bye.